If you haven't watched or listened to the episode I posted a few days ago about the mass shooting at the Wat Prom Kanaram Temple in Waddell, Arizona, you should go back and check it out. There's a link in the description. It was about the shooting murder of 9 members of a Buddhist temple, and it was carried out by 2 teenagers named Jonathan Duty and Alessandro Garcia, who went by Alex. For the first few months after the murders, investigators were led to believe that 4 other suspects had carried out the crime and had coerced all 4 of them into confessing, even though they were innocent. Eventually, despite their persistence to pin the crime on the Tucson 4, they connected the murder weapon to Jonathan and Alex, and after being interrogated, Alex confessed and took a plea deal to testify against Jonathan. Now, on the surface, the plea deal would exchange his testimony for removing the death penalty as an option for sentencing. But plea deals come with a ton of fine print. There are a lot of conditions to the deal, but they're generally a bunch of minutia that isn't really interesting in the grand scheme of things. One condition that's regularly added to the legal mumbo-jumbo is that the recipient of the deal has to confess to any other crimes they had committed outside of the ones they were already charged with. If they don't and evidence pops up somewhere that proves they were involved in a different crime, the terms of their deal can be voided. With that in mind, Alex chose to err on the side of caution and admit to another crime. Just 8 days before he was arrested for the temple shooting, he had been the second person involved in another senseless murder. This is Monsters. Michelle Hoover was born in February of 1977 and was an only child. She was described as a tomboy, was on the honor roll in school, and had never been in trouble. She started attending Agua Fria High School in August of 1991, which was where she met Alex Garcia a month later. After meeting Michelle, Alex broke up with his current girlfriend despite having recently given her a promise ring. It was a ring he was able to purchase with money he and his friend Jonathan Duty had stolen from a local Buddhist temple, the same one where they had murdered 9 people. After breaking up with his girlfriend, he and Michelle became inseparable. It was Michelle's first relationship, and like many youth with their first love, she became disinterested in anything else but Alex. Her grades started slipping and her friends weren't seeing her as frequently. Alex decided to put Michelle's undying love to the test, and on October 18th, just over 2 months since he had been involved in the temple shooting, he told Michelle that she needed to prove her love to him. In order to do that, she needed to kill someone. Michelle's father had a good-sized gun collection, so he didn't notice when a .22 caliber rifle and a Helwan 9mm handgun went missing. Michelle and Alex went to the Mesquite campground where Alex pointed out 51-year-old Alice Cameron to be Michelle's victim. She hesitated, but he said, quote, "If you love me, you'll do this." Michelle had to prove her love, so she approached the woman and shot her twice, which didn't immediately kill her. Alex grabbed her and made sure she didn't scream. Then they placed her in the bed of her truck and waited for her to die. They rummaged through her belongings and stole the little money she had on her. Then they fled the scene. The problem that many people have with this murder, besides the untimely death of Alice Cameron, is the fact that the investigators on the temple case had the murder weapon for that case in their possession, but hadn't had it tested because they were actively trying to pin that murder on 4 innocent people. If they had sent the Marlin .22 caliber rifle to the ballistics lab, they would have been told it was the temple shooting murder weapon, and they would have been led to Jonathan Duty and Alex Garcia much sooner, likely before Alice's murder could ever happen. That was one of the many aspects of the temple shooting investigation that was poorly carried out. But things would only get worse when the detectives assigned to Alice Cameron's murder would do the exact same thing with another innocent man. 46-year-old George Peterson had arrived at the Mesquite campground about an hour-and-a-half drive from downtown Phoenix, Arizona on October 15, 1991. George had served in the Marine Corps and was a Vietnam War veteran. When he arrived back in the States after the war, it was clear to his family that he was suffering from some mental health issues. VA records show that he had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, but it wasn't from combat like many would think. He had been stationed in Okinawa, where he had worked as a mechanic. Even though he didn't see active combat, his job was to clean and repair vehicles that had been in active combat. As benign as that might seem, working daily with vehicles that came in covered in blood was more than enough to take a heavy toll mentally. When he got home, he suffered from nightmares and flashbacks. George had spent the last few years traveling between where he had lived in Sanders, about 4 hours northeast of Phoenix, to the VA hospital in the city. During one of those trips, he stopped at the Mesquite campground for a few days to relax. The day that George arrived at the campground was a Tuesday, and on Friday, October 18th, he moved his campsite to a more secluded area to avoid the influx of weekend campers. That new campsite just happened to be about 75 yards or 68 meters away from Alice's campsite. That evening he made dinner, which was a military MRE, or meal ready to eat, and he wrote a letter to his mother. He went to sleep at about sunset, but was awoken in the middle of the night by what sounded like gunshots and someone yelling. The last time George had been camping, he thought someone was shooting at him, so he pulled out his .44 Magnum revolver and waited to defend himself. He heard what sounded like two vehicles and a thud that could have been something being loaded into the back of a truck. He heard male and female voices, but no more gunshots before it got quiet again. Alice's body was discovered at about 4 p.m. the following day. By the time authorities arrived, other campers had been in the crime scene and the area was contaminated. Alice was found lying face up in the bed of her truck, partially covered by a sheepskin blanket. She had been shot twice in the back. The sheriff's office took statements from 8 campers, one of whom was George. One camper said that he tried to find a spot at the end of the campground near Alice's campsite, but a young Hispanic man stepped out in front of them and said the area was full. When investigators learned that George was armed, they examined his gun and determined it had not been fired recently. They also searched his tent and vehicle and took a hair sample. The crime scene wasn't actually examined until the following day. Investigators found 2 spent 9mm casings on the ground and a 9mm bullet lodged in the side of Alice's truck bed. George was interviewed again, and it seemed that the detectives had decided he was a primary suspect. It's unknown how they came to that conclusion, and many believe it was because he was disheveled and they assumed he was a transient. The truth was, he owned a home and received a full military pension. He also was regularly treated by the VA and had always complied with the doctor's orders and always took his medication. It was something the detectives would never learn, as they would not speak to his family or anyone at the VA hospital. He cooperated with the investigators and let them search his belongings, where they found no signs of blood on anything he owned. They also couldn't match any of his shoes to the shoe prints at the scene. He became the only one of the 8 campers who they asked to come to the sheriff's office for an interview. It didn't happen right away, though. It was on the morning of October 22nd that George arrived at the sheriff's office. That interview lasted 15 hours, with only 2 10-minute breaks and 1 trip back to the campground so George could reenact events surrounding the murder. Most of the interrogation was not recorded, and it was 5 hours before Detective Donald Walsh read George's Miranda rights. During the unrecorded period, we have no idea what was said in the interrogation room, but the detective was able to get the veteran to confess to the murder. It was at 11:35 p.m., after George had confessed, that Detective Walsh turned on the recorder and asked George if he remembered his Miranda rights. George said, quote, "Something about rights?" which isn't really a strong affirmative answer. When the detective asked if he remembered his right to a lawyer, George responded, quote, "I wish I could afford one." That was a very important statement because it indicated that George did want a lawyer and only hadn't asked for one because he thought he would have to pay for it. At that point, the detective did not correct George and inform him that he was entitled to consult with a lawyer for free. From there, he had the man in custody repeat his confession, being guided the entire time. At one point, George said, quote, "I had difficulty with this one point, that it seems like I had another weapon. It seems like it's a 9mm. That was because George didn't have a 9mm and the authorities had never found one in his possession. At 1 a.m. on October 23, 1991, George Peterson was charged with the murder of Alice Cameron. What detectives would end up producing was a confession that said George had been woken up by voices at about 10 p.m. on the night of the murder, so he went for a walk. He took a 9mm handgun with him for protection. As he got near Alice's campsite, he heard a noise and thought it was a threat to himself, so he fired 2 rounds toward the pickup truck. Right then, Alice had stood up in the bed of the truck and was hit twice in the back. Then he threw the pistol in the river. The biggest problem with that story is the bullet that was lodged into the side of the truck bed. How did it get there if Alice was standing up when she was shot? Was it the magic JFK bullet that made a U-turn and then went down into the truck bed? It didn't make sense. Hopefully you've watched or listened to the episode about the temple shooting and you'll realize that there were now 5 people coerced into false confessions for 2 separate crimes involving the same person. If you're Alex Garcia, you must feel like you're invincible at that point, and that feeling would only get reinforced in the days after Alice's murder. Alex and Michelle had run away together on Thursday, October 17th, just a day before the campground murder. Michelle had stolen a .22 caliber rifle, 400 rounds of rifle ammunition, a 9mm pistol, and 24 rounds of 9mm ammunition from her father, and they took one of his company trucks. They had been gone for about 5 days before the Hoovers got confirmation that the teens had been spotted at a family cabin in Payson, Arizona, about 90 miles or 144 kilometers northeast of Phoenix. The cabin was just over the border into neighboring Gila County. When a deputy had arrived at the cabin on October 22nd, the place had clearly been used recently, but when he discovered a locked door on the 2nd floor, he backed out and called for backup. He knew the teens were armed and didn't want to chance it. When backup arrived, they announced their presence and instructed Alex to unlock the door and open it slowly, which he did. They were taken into custody, but since they were only runaways, they were released to Michelle's parents who came to the cabin to pick them up. It would be the Hoover family that collected the rifle and the handgun, but those weren't the only things they found in the cabin. While they were cleaning up, they found a second rifle, a pair of boots, and 2 military-style duffel bags. Inside the bags they found camouflage clothing and a handful of .22 caliber ammunition. They didn't say anything about the find to the authorities and gave the items back to Alex. Alex and Michelle said they had been at the cabin the entire time they were gone, so they were never considered suspects in the campground shooting. 4 days later, Alex was taken into custody as a suspect in the temple shooting. Eventually, Alex would take a plea deal in the temple shooting, and when he was told he had to confess to any other crimes he had committed, he told them that he and Michelle had killed Alice Cameron. On January 6, 1992, detectives arrived at the Hoover residence to question Michelle. She made it clear that she knew why they were there, but her father said they wouldn't talk without a lawyer. She would be the only person involved in either shooting who only spoke to the police with a lawyer present. Many people say, why would you talk to the police without a lawyer? But not everybody knows what you know now. Obviously, there are people with mental health issues or learning disabilities who don't know any better, and investigators regularly take advantage of that, like with George Peterson. Then there are some people who are raised by parents who beat the idea of trusting the authorities into their heads. Since the idea of cooperating with the authorities shouldn't be considered a bad thing, it does make some people grow up with a sense of security when it comes to the police. You also have to consider the age of the suspect and the time period. I was literally 14 in 1991, and at that time, I would have never thought to ask for a lawyer if the police wanted to question me about a murder I hadn't committed. I didn't get wise to the idea of only speaking to a lawyer until I was post-18 at least. So while I recommend you always ask for a lawyer if the police come to interview you, there are many understandable reasons why people don't do that, especially in the past before there were laws to protect children, people with mental health issues or learning disabilities, and even people who are intoxicated. After consulting a lawyer, Michelle went on to plead guilty to second-degree murder, and it was supposed to come with a 10-year prison sentence, but that was still at the judge's discretion. Alex had claimed that she was eager and even excited to commit murder, but in her own statement, she said she only did it because Alex had pushed her into it. During Michelle's sentencing, the prosecutor argued that she had claimed that she hadn't had a problem saying no to Alex when he asked for sex, but couldn't refuse his request that she murder someone. She also spent 8 months after his arrest writing him letters in jail, and it was clear that her infatuation with him had not faded. Her silence about the murder caused an innocent man to sit in jail for more than a year. Alice's sister Helen Fletcher made a statement at the sentencing hearing. She said, quote, "We are told by Michelle that 10 years is forever. No, Michelle, 10 years is not forever. It is 3,650 days in which you can receive letters, gifts, visits, and phone calls. Death is forever, and death is what you gave my sister." The judge ended up sentencing Michelle to 15 years in prison. She served her sentence without incident and was released on May 12, 2008 at the age of 31. The murder charge for Alex was rolled into his plea deal in the Temple shooting case, and he did not receive any additional prison time. Even after having arrested the 2 people who had murdered Alice Cameron, George stayed in jail. He had been in jail for 14 months awaiting trial where the prosecutor was seeking the death penalty, and they knew he was innocent. His public defender finally got around to taking Detective Walsh's deposition in September of 1992. That was when the problems with the Miranda warning were discovered. She also found out that a composite sketch of a Hispanic male had been made based on information from other campers. It took a few months after that for George to finally be released, and like the Tucson Four, he also filed a lawsuit against Maricopa County for false arrest and detention. That lawsuit involved an even larger investigation of how the authorities had gotten a confession from George, especially after the shameful tactics used against the Tucson Four. In an effort to cover up the fact that Alice Cameron would have never died if they had tested the Temple shooting murder weapon when they had gotten it, Maricopa County agreed to settle with George for $1.1 million. Most of the deputies involved in the campsite shooting case were transferred out of the county or fired. 3 teenagers in the Phoenix area would go on to end the lives of 10 people. Alex Garcia was part of both murders, making people question his story that it was Jonathan and Michelle who had actually done all of the murdering. It seemed to many people that Alex was excited about murder, and it wasn't just a coincidence that he was present during multiple cold-blooded murders. Of course, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office helped make Alice Cameron's murder happen, revealing that the real monsters aren't always only the ones who did the actual killing. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.